My wife's coworker called me and said, "I saw your wife kissing the boss at the company party." I didn't hesitate. I didn't question, I didn't doubt, I didn't argue. I just got up from my chair, my heart pounding between my ribs, as if something inside me already knew, and yet, a part of me insisted on not believing. I got in the car and drove there, like a man who walks by instinct, not logic. On the way, I convinced myself there was a misunderstanding, a mix-up, a misperception, some moment of drunkenness that could be explained. I tried to repeat to myself, she couldn't do that. She would never do that. But what I found when I arrived was a silence that screamed louder than any scream. She was smiling, carefree, surrendered. Her body fit naturally against his. And the kiss. The kiss wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. I was less than 10 meters away, and she didn't even notice. The world, in that instant, simply fell apart around me. Everything we built, everything we shared, every promise, every late night talking about the future, everything was annulled by that moment when she laughed at his joke, rested her face on his shoulder and kissed him as if no one else existed. I left before she saw me. Not because he was a coward, but because there was nothing more to say. Betrayal, sometimes, isn't in words, it's in the scene the heart can't unsee. I got in the car, not knowing where to go. I drove until I ran out of gas. And there, under the dawn sky, with the bitter smell of disappointment permeating the steering wheel, I wrote on a piece of paper, "I will not return to a house where loyalty has been driven out." I left it on the table, along with the ring, like someone returning something that no longer belongs. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't break dishes. I just left. Because silence hurts more for those who betray. For days, she didn't understand. She called, texted, and asked for explanations as if she didn't know exactly what she'd done. She tried to convince me it was an isolated mistake, a moment of weakness. But accidental mistakes don't usually happen at parties with low music, ambient lighting, and knowing glances. A mistake can't be sustained with your hands clasped behind another man's back. A mistake isn't so well choreographed. What happened there was a decision. A clear, conscious choice, made with open eyes. She tried to keep the affair going. She thought it was the beginning of a new life. She thought her boss's easy smile was a sign of the future, not just a reflection of the inflated vanity of a man accustomed to conquering what doesn't belong to him. But within a few weeks, the illusion crumbled. The boss made it clear, it was fun. Momentary. Fleeting. She had traded a home for a break. Love for a pastime. Before she knew it, she was alone. And only when loneliness overwhelmed her pride did she come looking for me. Knocking on the door with red eyes, a choked voice, and trembling hands. She asked for forgiveness, said she loved me, begged for another chance. But time had already given me back my peace. I was already with someone new. It wasn't an overwhelming passion, the kind that knocks you off your feet, but it was a calm love, with a sincere touch and an unwavering presence. Someone who looked me in the eye without hiding secrets, who laughed at my bad jokes, who listened when I talked about what hurt me. With her, I didn't need to doubt. And that's why I forgave the woman who betrayed me. Not because I wanted her back. But because I realized that holding on to resentment would be like letting it linger inside me. And she no longer had that place. When I said, "I've forgiven you, but forgiving doesn't mean getting back together," I saw in her eyes the exact moment the floor fell open. That's when she understood. That's when everything inside her collapsed. Because until that moment, she still thought there was a chance. She still harbored the illusion that repentance was enough to fix things. But some wounds heal on the outside and fester on the inside. And when she realized the door was closed, not out of revenge, but out of self-love, that's when the story took a turn. She cried. She begged. She fell to her knees. She said her life no longer made sense without me. But it was too late. I was no longer the man who left that night. I was back to who I was before her, whole. Time passed. And it was on one of those gray days that she sought me out once more. But not to ask. Not to beg. Just to deliver a letter. A single handwritten page, with painful, sincere words. And beside it, a small box. Inside, a photo of us, from the time when her eyes still sparkled when she saw me. But there was also something else, an old note I'd written to her on our first anniversary. She'd kept it all these years. And she returned it with moist eyes, as if acknowledging the weight of what she'd lost. But that wasn't the last time we met. Months later, I received an unexpected call. She wanted to see me. She said it was important, that she needed closure. I was reluctant. But I went. I arrived at her apartment and found someone completely different. Tired eyes, a low voice, a loneliness spread throughout the room. She didn't want to ask for anything more. She just wanted to talk. She said she remembers every day what she lost. That she wakes up scared thinking she can still get it back, but soon realizes it's all gone. And then she told me something that disarmed me. In her last attempt to win me back, she firmly believed I still loved her. That my silence was protection. That my refusal was fear. That I would return. So when I went to her house, she filled her heart with hope, fixed her hair, played our music softly, and prepared words of reunion. But I only went there to say goodbye. She said that was the worst day of her life. Because for the first time, she understood that regret doesn't bring anyone back. That certain choices can't be undone. That some kisses cost love. That some mistakes can't be undone. And it was at that moment that I realized something curious, even with everything she'd done to me, even after the pain, the humiliation, and the loss, I no longer felt anger. I felt pity. Not the arrogant pity of someone who feels superior. But the sincere pity of someone who sees someone sinking in waters they dug with their own hands. That day, she told me, if I had a chance to go back in time, I would do everything differently. And I simply replied, time only moves forward. And so do I. She smiled with tears in her eyes and said that, as much as it hurt, she was happy I'd moved on. She asked if I was truly happy. And I replied, without hesitation, for the first time in a long time, I am. She nodded, as if she understood and accepted. And then she said to me, in a low voice, thank you for loving me like no one else ever will. And forgive me, for discovering this too late. The silence that followed was the loudest of all. A silence laden with memories, with unfulfilled desires, with futures that would never be. And as I walked away, I heard the door close behind me. This time, forever. But what she never knew, is that the night before the kiss that destroyed everything, I had booked tickets for a surprise trip. We were going to celebrate our wedding anniversary in Paris. Everything was planned, hotel, restaurant with a view of the Eiffel Tower, vow renewal with a new ring. She never knew about it. And maybe that's for the best. Because there are truths that, if revealed, hurt more than they heal. But what did she do after that? What does a woman do when she realizes, too late, that she has lost the love of her life? Welcome to the channel. Here, we never romanticize or condone any kind of betrayal. The stories you'll hear are fictional, but they carry profound truths. Our purpose is to show, unvarnished, how betrayal can destroy homes, hearts, and entire lives. Prepare now to dive into an intense, painful, and shocking story. Take a deep breath, and let the truth behind the wrong choice begin. His name was Daniel. She, Helena. Two common names, but two souls that, for a time, seemed to belong together, as if the world had been designed around their embrace. They met in their early 20s, in a small coffee shop, where he read Bukowski in silence while she discussed an advertising campaign script with coworkers. Helena always had an energy that drew everything around her. When she smiled, the room changed color, as if her presence could silence people's inner noise. Daniel, on the other hand, was made of stillness and depth. He didn't say much, but when he did, he said the essentials. He observed the world like someone reading a book, attentively, devotedly, and patiently. He was the kind of man who knows how to listen. And it was this, perhaps, that made Helena stop talking to the others in that cafe and start looking at him. Their first encounter wasn't cinematic. No stumbles, no perfect exchange of glances. It was casual, discreet, real. Daniel excused himself to pull up a chair, she smiled gratefully, and so fate began its work. In the following months, what was just an occasional encounter became routine. And from routine came comfort. Lunches during work breaks, nighttime walks through the city streets, lazy Sundays watching old series and discussing philosophy, advertising, and how much they hated sugar in their coffee. They worked. Not spectacularly, but sincerely. And that, in a world of shallow loves, was more than enough. Living together allowed them to discover each other's limits. Helena, with her passion for work and voracious ambition, had an almost cruel tendency toward perfectionism. She was dedicated, yes, but sometimes she forgot to breathe. Daniel reminded her of this with his almost unsteady calm, as if he didn't understand the rush of the world. He was a literature teacher at a high school and loved what he did, even though he earned little. Money was never a priority for him. Life was. And in this, the two tried to balance each other, she pushed upward, he pulled inward. And, for a long time, it worked. They were the perfect balance and imbalance. The apartment they shared reflected both of them, books stacked on one side, plants and minimalist paintings on the other. Helena loved keeping things orderly, even though she lived within the chaos of work. Daniel, more messy, found poetry even in the dirty dishes piling up in the sink. He said it showed they'd lived well. She said it was a lack of organization. And amid these small disagreements, they built a daily life full of affection. Helena would arrive home late from work, tired, but with her eyes shining from a compliment the director had given her about the latest campaign. Daniel would welcome her with a glass of wine or a simple dinner, prepared while he read a poem by Neruda or listened to bossa nova at a low volume. There were days when they barely spoke, and others when they would stay up until dawn lying on the living room rug, laughing at silly memories. The marriage proposal happened without much fuss. Daniel didn't rent a restaurant, buy fireworks, or hire a secret photographer. He simply looked at her one night, while she was barefoot, wearing his t-shirt and heating food in the microwave, and thought, this is it. He proposed right then and there, with a makeshift ring and a nervous smile. Helena laughed, cried, and said yes. Because even amidst all his imperfections, he made the world seem bearable. The wedding was simple, but full of truth. Close friends, family gathered, sincere tears, and promises exchanged without exaggeration. It was as if both knew that real life would begin later, with the split bills, the fights over petty matters, the silent reconciliations, and the days when love would need to be chosen, not just felt. The first few years were beautiful. Daniel continued teaching passionately and writing short chronicles in a notebook he never showed anyone. Helena grew within the agency, taking on larger roles, leading teams, and immersing herself ever deeper into the corporate world. Time became scarce. The nights became shorter. Dinners became quieter. But there was still affection. There was still care. He understood her tight deadlines, and she respected his creative silence. Even when everything seemed to be rushing, they found each other. In the kitchen, in bed, in each other's eyes. Love was a habit that endured. But habits, no matter how strong, sometimes tire. And so, without them realizing it, the separation began. A subtle space between their bodies, a lack of time that stopped being the exception and became the rule. Helena began sleeping later and later, answering emails on her cell phone, the blue light illuminating a tired, distracted face. Daniel began spending more time away, inventing school projects, organizing reading groups, and returning later. When they saw each other, they looked at each other, but they no longer saw each other as before. Their conversations, once fluid, became occasional exchanges. As if, unintentionally, they had stopped asking how the other was really doing. But it wasn't a lack of love. It was carelessness. It was the illusion that love alone would be enough. Despite everything, there were still good times. Short weekend trips, little gifts left on the pillow, unexpected messages throughout the day. Helena liked to say that Daniel was her calm. And Daniel, even without saying much, still saw her as his favorite storm. They both knew there was something there, a story built carefully, with mistakes and successes, but true. And that was what kept them together, even when the world around them seemed to want to tear them away from each other. Daniel sometimes tried to reconnect with what was lost. He brought her coffee in bed, invited her out, left notes in the books she read before bed. Helena smiled, thanked her, but returned to her cell phone, to her report, to the fast-paced world that swallowed her. Not out of malice, but out of exhaustion. Success was beginning to take its toll, sleepless nights, chest pains, growing anxiety. Still, she wouldn't stop. It was as if she were always competing with her own reflection, trying to prove something she didn't even know what it was. Daniel watched. Tried to understand. Tried to maintain himself. At the agency, Helena stood out more each month. And with success came invitations, events, and new connections. Daniel was no longer as present in these environments, not out of insecurity, but because he didn't feel like he belonged. Her universe seemed to have created its own language, full of codes, dynamics, and names he didn't recognize. Still, he supported her. With sincere pride, with silent love. Always present. Always there. Even when he felt, little by little, invisible. Sometimes Daniel found himself reading the old chronicles he'd written about her in the early years. There were entire texts about the way she twirled her hair with her finger when she was concentrating, the way she squinted when she truly laughed, the way she fit into his embrace on cold mornings. He'd read them and think, it's still her, but at the same time, it's not anymore. And it hurt. But he persisted. Because when you truly love someone, you keep trying until there's no whole piece left to give. Helena, in her silences, also felt the absence. She knew Daniel was there, but she began to wonder if he still saw her. She began to sense that perhaps they had taken parallel paths, no longer intertwined. But she didn't speak either. And so, between silent absences and muffled presences, the days passed. The relationship continued, but without the brilliance of its early days. Like a sunset scene from inside a building, still beautiful, but too distant to warm. And it was in that distance, in that accumulated silence, that something began to shift. Something that, at that moment, neither of them could name. But it was already there. In the air. In the absences that no longer bothered. In the presences that no longer comforted. And what began as small, imperceptible cracks would soon become a crack that would change everything. But even then, love still lingered. Subtly, almost imperceptibly, but real. There was still hope. There were still memories. There was still the sound of her laughter in his ears. And the memory of his touch on nights when she felt lost. Nothing seemed to really threaten. Until the day everything changed. Helena was at her peak. The new campaign, which she had conceived with almost obsessive dedication, had been approved without corrections. Praise was flying throughout the company like sparks ready to ignite. Management was showing increasing interest in her, and her name was beginning to be whispered in the hallways with a rare tone of admiration. The invitation to the agency's annual event, a private celebration reserved for the company's top talents, came as confirmation that she had finally crossed an invisible line, the one that separates ordinary talent from those who would be remembered. At home, she shared the news with a radiant smile, her eyes shining with excitement. Daniel listened attentively, returning her smile with the same affection as always, but inside, something throbbed silently, like an off-key note in a once perfect melody. He knew Helena was growing up, and he sincerely rooted for her. He admired her strength, her hunger for the future, the way she threw herself into challenges as if she had a pact with excellence. But in recent months, that same ambition that had enchanted him was now beginning to cast shadows between them. It was as if, with each achievement of hers, a small distance appeared between what they were and what they could still be. Daniel tried not to think about it too much. He remained the attentive, present partner, always willing to listen. But sometimes, when she locked herself in her room for hours in virtual meetings or spent entire days away, he wondered if he was still part of the plan. The event approached, and with it, the euphoria in Helena's eyes grew. It was as if that moment had become the new center of her life. She spent days choosing the right outfit, dedicating herself to the smallest details, adjusting her schedule with surgical precision. Daniel, for his part, watched everything with a silent smile. She invited him to accompany her, but the way she did it, almost automatically, made him decline. He told her she would be better off with her colleagues, to enjoy it. She seemed relieved by his answer, though she masked it with a quick kiss and an "I love you," while checking a notification on her phone. That night, the house was silent. Daniel prepared a simple meal, put on some soft music, and tried to immerse himself in a book he'd already read twice. But words wouldn't find a place. There was an uncomfortable restlessness in his chest, something he couldn't name. Around 10 o'clock, he received an unexpected call. A female voice, firm but nervous. It was a colleague of Helena's. She'd had a little too much to drink and, perhaps out of guilt or impulse, decided to speak. The sentence was as direct as an arrow in the dark: "I saw your wife kissing the boss at the company party." The silence after that seemed eternal. Daniel didn't respond immediately. He stood still, the phone still pressed to his ear, as if the words hadn't fully sunk in. He politely thanked her and hung up. His heart was pounding wildly, as if trying to escape his chest. For a full minute, he stared at the living room floor, completely still. Then he stood up, grabbed his car keys, and left without saying a word. The drive to the venue was a kind of trance. The city lights blurred before his eyes. Inside him, a war raged, on one side, the desperate hope that it was a misunderstanding, on the other, the muffled voice of something he'd always known but refused to hear. Arriving at the venue, Daniel didn't park immediately. He remained in the car for a few minutes, observing the illuminated facade, listening to the muffled sound of music escaping through the walls. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the turmoil within him. He entered with slow, almost hesitant steps, as if each step were a betrayal of himself. The hall was full, sophisticatedly decorated, with soft lights and loose laughter filling the air. But he wasn't looking for anyone. His eyes darted anxiously, uncontrollably, until they stopped. There they were. Helena and the boss. Laughing. Too close. Their gestures said more than any words could. The way he touched her arm, the way she looked at him, the long stretch of time between words. It was an intimacy that couldn't be disguised. Daniel stood still, watching from afar, as time dissolved into pain. And then, without warning, he saw her lips touch his. A kiss. A gesture that tore everything apart inside. He didn't react. Didn't scream. Didn't confront her. He simply turned and walked away, as if the ground were no longer firm beneath his feet. He drove for hours, aimlessly. He didn't cry. Not yet. He just felt a growing emptiness, as if everything he believed in until then had evaporated. He arrived home as the sky was already lightening. He took off his wedding ring and wrote on a piece of paper the only words he could muster: "I will not return to a house where loyalty has been driven out." He left the note on the table next to the ring. And he left. No bags. No warnings. No return. In the following days, Helena tried to contact him. First with casual messages, trying to understand. Then with desperate calls. At no point did she mention what had happened, as if still trying to maintain the illusion. But Daniel didn't respond. He was far away, in a room rented from a friend, trying to piece together what was left of himself. Friends tried to understand, family asked, but he said nothing. Because there was pain that needed no audience. And betrayals that, once seen, speak volumes. Helena began to slowly collapse. He realized something was off when he got home and found the ring on the table. The note. And the emptiness. He tried calling again, then 10 more. Nothing. He sat on the couch and stayed there for hours, staring at the silence that screamed louder than any explanation he could offer. That night, she slept in bed alone for the first time in years. And even wrapped in the sheets, she felt cold. The following days were spent in denial. She tried to justify to herself that she had overreacted, that Daniel was being impulsive. That maybe there was still time. But deep down, she knew. She knew from the moment his eyes met hers, even from afar. She knew from the kiss. She knew even before. She knew, but she pretended not to. At work, she tried to maintain her composure. But the stares began to weigh heavily on her. The colleague who had made the call never identified herself, but there was a tense atmosphere. Her boss, for his part, remained distant. That night had been, for him, just another one. For her, it was the beginning of the end. Daniel, silently, went on with his life. Not as if nothing had happened, but as if he had decided not to die inside. He returned to his work, finding refuge in the pages he wrote, in his classes, in conversations with people who knew nothing. And in the midst of this attempt at reconstruction, he met someone. Someone who didn't ask too many questions, but listened attentively. Who smiled with her eyes, who looked at him with the simplicity he had forgotten existed. Meanwhile, Helena was falling apart. The nights grew long, the bed too big, the silence piercing. She began to look at photos, reread old messages, relive moments that once seemed routine and now seemed like lost treasures. The smell of his shirt was still in the closet. And that hurt more than any scream. But she didn't give up. Not yet. He decided to try one more time. To look for her. To tell her he regretted it. That he loved her. That it was all a mistake. That nothing made sense without her. What she didn't know, was that Daniel had already followed. And what she was about to discover, would change everything. Time had passed, but what remained in Helena was something that wouldn't heal. Her routine no longer made sense, and the silence of the house she once shared with Daniel was now a field of pulsating memories. His absence was in every corner, in every morning that didn't begin with the smell of his coffee brewing, in every night that didn't end with his calm breathing beside her. She no longer rushed to meet deadlines, cared less about meetings, clients, or the accolades she once dreamed of achieving. Everything had seemed purposeless since the day she saw him leave. Regret didn't arrive like a wave, but like a steady tide that slowly swallowed her certainties, her pride, and her false confidence that everything could be reversed. She had betrayed the only love that had ever been her refuge, and now, even with the world spinning around her, she remained stuck in the same place, facing loss. She tried to reach out to him a few times. She sent messages that went unanswered, wrote and rewrote texts, rehearsed apologies, drafted confessions. But he didn't respond, and the silence said more than any words she could have imagined. Until one morning, a mutual friend told her that Daniel was fine. That he was with someone else. That he had started smiling again. There was no resentment in the news, but there was a weight. Helena felt the ground slip beneath her feet. She knew it was deserved. She knew she couldn't demand anything. But knowing he had moved on was like losing the right to regret forever. That's when she decided to seek him out in person. She didn't know what to say. She didn't expect to win him back, but she needed to talk, needed to get rid of the guilt that was consuming her. She arranged to meet him at a discreet cafe where they had gone years before. He accepted, with the same politeness he always had, and arrived a few minutes early, as usual. She entered hesitantly and saw him. He looked different. His gaze was lighter, his face more serene. The pain was still there, but she seemed tamed, collected. She sat down, trying to contain the trembling in her hands, and before she could say anything, he greeted her with a restrained smile. She took a deep breath and began to speak. She said she had made a mistake, that she had no excuses, that she didn't want to rewrite the past, but that she needed to ask for forgiveness, looking him in the eye. That she had lost more than she imagined, and that no success, no party, no kiss outside of that place had made her feel even a fragment of what she felt with him. Daniel listened to everything without interrupting, his eyes steady but gentle. When she finished, there was a silence in the air that weighed as heavily as the words spoken. He then said he had already forgiven, not for her sake, but for himself. That he had understood that the mistake wasn't about the love he offered, but about her inability to receive it. That moving on wasn't easy, but necessary. And that now he had peace, and peace, after what they had been through, was something he wouldn't give up again. She nodded, trying to hold back her tears. She knew there was no going back, but knowing he was okay hurt more than if he still hated her. So, before getting up, she took a small box from her bag. It was dark wood, simple. She handed it to him and said she wanted him to see it. Not to reconnect, nor to stir up the past, but because he needed to know. Daniel stared at the box for a few seconds before opening it. Inside, he found an old envelope, with his name handwritten, and a photo of the two of them, still young, sitting on the porch, laughing. He recognized the image, it was one of his favorites. But he didn't remember printing it. He opened the envelope and removed a folded sheet. The paper was thick, letter-sized. He began to read, and as his eyes slid over the words, Daniel's body changed. His previously serene expression began to close, his eyes widening almost imperceptibly. When he finished reading, he left the paper on the table and looked at Helena as if looking at a stranger. The letter was proof that the betrayal had begun before the party. It wasn't an isolated kiss, nor a sudden mistake. Helena had kept the affair quiet for longer than she'd let on. The coworker who called that night. It wasn't an impulse. It was a cry for help. Someone close to her who, knowing what was happening, watched the man unknowingly be destroyed. The betrayal wasn't a moment, it was a process. A process Helena tried to hide with small gestures, calculated silences, and empty promises. And most devastating, the letter revealed that Helena's boss had promised her a possible promotion, a directorship. A professional plan she believed to be real, to the point of betting her own marriage as a bargaining chip. Daniel said nothing for a few seconds. He was breathing heavily, as if he'd been punched in the stomach. Finally, in a low, firm voice, he asked if it was all true. Helena, her eyes already brimming with tears, nodded. She said it was confusing at first, that she'd gotten carried away, that she'd believed in things she now understands were illusions. That her boss had made promises but never had any real intention. That after the party, he'd walked away, and that she realized too late how much she destroyed herself by trying to climb a ladder that didn't exist. Daniel then leaned back in his chair. He was quiet, but not cold. There was a silent mourning there, an ending that was now fully visible. He simply said that everything made sense now. That the silences, the absences, the vague apologies, and the hurried kisses weren't delusions. That he felt everything, but chose to trust. Because that was what love was. Choosing to trust even when instinct told him otherwise. Helena cried, defenseless, without a mask. He said that if he could go back, he wouldn't hesitate to do everything differently. But he didn't answer. He took the box, sealed the envelope, and said he didn't need to know anything anymore. That he already had what he needed. That now he could finally close the door completely. She tried to tell him she still loved him, that not a day went by without thinking about him, that her life was meaningless without that love. But he just stood up, looked at her one last time with a mix of pain and acceptance, and told her she had it all, and chose something else. That it wasn't about anger anymore, it was about freedom. And that, for him, freedom now meant living away from what hurt him. Helena stood there, alone, with the box in her hand and her heart in pieces. Because there was nothing more to say. And on that silent afternoon, he understood that the true punishment for betrayal wasn't remorse. It was watching the person who once loved you with everything they had, walk away without a backward glance. But there was something Daniel still didn't know. Something she'd never had the courage to tell him. Something her boss would never tell her. And that could still change everything. Daniel walked aimlessly after leaving the cafe. Helena's words still echoed like shrapnel inside his chest, but now the sound was quieter. It hurt, yes, but there was also a strange kind of relief, as if he had finally closed a book that had been open for too long. He walked for blocks without understanding where he was going, until he found himself in front of an old bookstore where he used to spend hours in his loneliest times. He entered, perhaps reflexively, perhaps in search of some kind of quiet refuge. Inside, the smell of aged pages welcomed him better than any words. He picked up a copy of an author Helena hated, sat in the most hidden corner, and just stayed there, not really reading, just breathing. For the first time in a long time, he no longer needed to understand anything. Everything was clear, painfully clear. Meanwhile, Helena headed home, not knowing exactly how she'd gotten there. She parked the car in the garage, but remained inside for a long time, her fingers gripping the steering wheel as if that gesture could stop her chest from exploding. The tears fell with a force she could no longer control. The image of Daniel leaving, without anger, without promises, just with that strange, serene indifference, was worse than any scream. She climbed the stairs to the apartment as if carrying her own body out of obligation. Upon entering, she was greeted by the same emptiness as always. But now, that emptiness screamed. She could no longer stand that huge bed, that sofa where they shared TV shows, that kitchen where he wrote funny notes on the refrigerator. Everything was overwhelming her. She threw her shoes down the hallway, ripped off her blouse as if to shed her own skin, and fell to the living room floor, embracing nothingness. Hours passed. And then, in the early hours of the morning when the world seemed to be asleep, she made the decision she'd been putting off since the beginning of it all. She picked up her phone, opened an old conversation, and wrote. Not to Daniel, but to the wife of the man she'd been involved with. Helena wasn't stupid. She knew he was married. From the beginning. She knew his promises of separation were empty. She knew every word he'd said was meticulously calculated to make her believe things would be different. But now, with everything falling apart, she needed to somehow break that cycle of lies that had not only destroyed her but continued silently, corroding other lives. She wrote a few lines. She told the essentials. She said she didn't expect understanding, she just thought it was fair for her to know. And she sent it. The next day, Helena's boss showed up at the agency, his face pale, his eyes sunken, and a fury disguised as civility. He asked to speak with her privately. They went to the conference room, and he closed the door with a force far too strong for someone trying to appear calm. Helena's expression was calmer than she expected. He asked if she had lost her mind, if she knew what she had done. She replied no, that she had finally regained her sanity. He said his wife had left home, that she had left him after reading the message. Helena, without hesitation, asked if that hurt more than seeing someone you loved leave without saying a word. He remained silent. The silence of a man who never considered facing the consequences of his own lies. Finally, he stood up, threatened consequences, but she laughed. He said there was nothing left to lose. Her reputation was already in ruins, her true love too, and now only the truth remained. She was afraid of nothing else. He left the room and, for the first time in years, Helena breathed as if she had removed a stone from her lung. The days that followed were confusing, intense, but strangely liberating. Helena began to write. He took the nights and transformed them into letters he never sent. She wrote to Daniel, to herself, to the woman she had been, and to the woman she was still trying to discover if she existed. Loneliness was different now. No longer a punishment, but a consequence. And amid this attempt at reconstruction, she began revisiting old places. He went to that coffee shop where they had met, sat at the same table, ordered the same bitter coffee. Everything was still there, but without him, nothing made the same sense. Yet, he remained. Because she no longer ran from herself. Meanwhile, Daniel continued living. With firm but light steps. He was involved with a new woman, Clara, whose name conveyed exactly what she represented, clarity. With her, there were no gray areas, no games, no false promises. Everything was very simple, very honest. There wasn't Helena's explosive intensity, but there was tranquility, complicity, and, above all, respect. Clara knew the story. Not in detail, but enough to respect his silences. And Daniel, little by little, began to smile again with his whole body, not just his lips. One day, while they were walking hand in hand through a book fair, he found an old copy of a novel he had given Helena as a gift years ago. He glanced at the cover, flipped through a few pages, but didn't buy it. He smiled and moved on. It was over. It was over. But fate sometimes seems to like to take a twist before closing a cycle. And it was at a lecture on emotional creativity hosted by a local institute that Daniel and Helena met again. He had been invited as a speaker because his writing was gaining recognition. She, seeking inner reconstruction, signed up without knowing who would be on stage. When she saw his name on the poster, it was too late to leave. She sat at the back, in the last row, her heart hammering in her chest as if she wanted to escape. Daniel, as he took the stage, saw her face. For an instant, their eyes met. He didn't look away. He continued. He spoke about words, about losses that transform us, about silences that scream louder than sounds. Helena cried from beginning to end of the lecture. She didn't leave at the end. She stayed, waiting for him, not knowing exactly what she would do. He came to her. They stood facing each other and said nothing for a few seconds. He, with calm eyes. She, with tears in her eyes. She said she hadn't expected to find him there, that she hadn't gone looking for him. He said he knew. She said she'd read every text he'd published in the last few months. That she recognized every feeling there. That she was sorry. That she felt everything. Daniel didn't hug her, didn't hold her hand. He just listened. When she finished, he said time had taught her many things. That he hadn't forgotten, but it no longer hurt. That the wound had become a scar, and that scars are memories, not sentences. He said he forgave her, again. That he hoped she would forgive herself too. She smiled with sadness and relief. She said she was trying. That she didn't want him back, or for anything to change. She just wanted him to know that she was never the same after losing him. Daniel replied that she didn't have to be the same. That no one does. But true love, the kind that cares, that stays, that chooses, she wouldn't find where she'd left it. Before leaving, she asked if he was happy. And for the first time, he answered lightly, yes, very much so. And this time, she believed him. That night, Helena returned home and wrote her last letter. Not to send. Just to close the cycle. In the letter, there were no more excuses, no regrets, no promises. Just gratitude. For having known love. For having experienced love. And for having learned, the hard way, that not all love survives neglect. Daniel, meanwhile, returned home with Clara, and as he lay beside her, he felt something that had been elusive for years, peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from the absence of problems, but the peace of knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be. And there, each in their place, they finally knew that the story had ended. Not with reconciliation. But with truth. With consequence. With liberation. The days following their reunion were quietly intense for both of them. While on the outside, life resumed its usual rhythm, on the inside, something had changed definitively. Daniel returned home that night with a solid calm, as if he had finally closed the last chapter of a book he had finished long ago but insisted on keeping open. He didn't talk about his encounter with Clara, not out of omission, but because there was no resentment or residue to explain. The past now had a place, it was past. But deep inside him, something still processed the weight of what Helena had said. Love, no matter how betrayed, doesn't disappear without a trace. And although he had found a new path alongside someone whole and sweet, it was impossible not to feel that echo of everything that had once been real between them, like a memory lit for a final instant before finally fading away. Helena, on the other hand, plunged into a slower, more solitary, and therefore more profound process of reconstruction. For the first time in a long time, she no longer relied on applause, positions, or external validation. She began attending therapy sessions regularly, not in search of a justification to alleviate her guilt, but to understand why she had been able to turn her back on something so precious. She learned to face her own emptiness and understand that the betrayal she committed didn't begin with a kiss, but with emotional neglect, with the daily deflection of small emotional commitments, with the repeated choice to prioritize everything except those who loved her. She began to look in the mirror unadorned, without internal discourses to shield her from the pain, and this, cruel as it was also liberating. Accepting that she had destroyed her own home with her own hands wasn't the end of the pain, it was the beginning of a different way of living, one that no longer pretended. She left the agency a few weeks after her last conversation with Daniel. She resigned permanently. She couldn't stand the same hallways, the same sly glances, the weight of a reputation tarnished not only by marital infidelity but by her involvement with someone who used his power to seduce and manipulate. The environment no longer represented anything, and if she wanted to rebuild something from the inside out, she had to leave. She moved to a smaller, quieter place, with fewer memories. She began to live more simply, rediscovering things she had forgotten. She returned to painting, something she had done in her teens and which, in the rush of her career, she had buried as something of another time. The paintings began as guilty blurs, dark tones, undefined shapes. But over time, they began to gain color, space, lightness. They weren't works of art, but they were honest. And that, for her, was enough. Daniel, for his part, was delving deeper and deeper into his new relationship. Clara was calm, but not passive. He had a firmness that didn't compete with his own, but complemented it. She was a woman who didn't treat him as a substitute for anyone, who didn't try to fix him, but welcomed him just as he was. There was a naturalness between them that dispensed with grand gestures, because respect was constant. Even so, Daniel had a restless side, which sometimes caught him remembering words, gestures, and looks from the past, not with longing, but with a strange pang of sadness. It was as if, despite all the forgiveness, there was a scar that throbbed on certain days, the darkest ones. Clara noticed these moments, didn't pressure him to talk, but her constant presence anchored him. She wasn't the kind of woman who demanded to be first in someone's life, because she knew that being in the present, with honesty, was always more valuable than competing with a past that could not be erased. One day, Helena received an unexpected call. It was the wife of the man she had been involved with. The number appeared on the screen, and for a few seconds, she considered not answering. But something inside her told her it was time. She answered with a firm voice, but her heart pounding. On the other end, the woman said she wasn't calling for revenge, nor to demand anything. She was calling because, after months of digesting everything, she wanted to say she had begun to understand that Helena had also been used. She said she didn't forgive her, but she no longer felt anger. That there was no more pain, only exhaustion. That she had rebuilt her life, and that now, with clarity, she could see the man she had been by her side for so long as someone she no longer recognized. Helena thanked him, choking back tears that left no time for a response. When she hung up, she stood in the kitchen for long minutes, phone still in hand, trying to comprehend the complexity of everything they had been through. That call didn't erase anything, but it brought a kind of closure she never thought she would have. It was also around this time that she began teaching art classes to teenagers at a community center. She didn't earn much, but it was the first time in years that she felt genuinely useful. The students knew nothing about her past, and this liberated her. With them, she could simply be someone who taught them how to transform pain into color, disorder into form. She realized that many of the young people carried invisible scars, emotional wounds that emerged in the way they held the paintbrush or in the silence they carried. And it was there that she understood, for the first time, the power of reconstruction. Art, like love, also demands commitment. But unlike love, it allows for mistakes. And these mistakes, when welcomed, can generate beauty. She began to allow herself to make mistakes, to stumble, to learn. Life, she thought, no longer owed her chances, but she owed it to herself to try to start over. One random weekend, Daniel received an invitation to teach a creative writing workshop at that same community center. He accepted without hesitation. Writing had always been his refuge, and now it was his craft as well. When he arrived, he was warmly introduced to everyone. One of the organizers led him to the room where the workshop would take place, and as he passed one of the hallway windows, he saw Helena in the courtyard, surrounded by young people, helping a student finish a painting. He froze for a moment. He hadn't expected to see her there, much less like that, unassuming, in simple clothes, hair tied back awkwardly, and a slight smile. She seemed like another woman. Or perhaps, the version of her he'd never met. He walked into the room without saying anything. During the class, she shared stories, read texts from the participants, and concluded with a free-writing exercise. At the end of the workshop, as he was tidying up his papers, he heard a voice behind him. It was her. They stood face to face again, but now there was no pain, no shock. Only a respectful silence. She said she hadn't expected to see him there. He replied that neither had he. They laughed. It was a small laugh, but genuine. Helena thanked him for the workshop, saying the young people were delighted. Daniel praised her for the way she led the group. They talked about the center, the students, how art had helped them in different ways. For a brief moment, they were just two people with a shared past, but with new paths to follow. When they said goodbye, he said he was happy to see her like this. She thanked him, her eyes full but firm. She said she, too, was happy to see him well. And they parted there, without promises, without repetitions, without pending issues. On the way home, Daniel told Clara about the encounter. There was no awkwardness, just honesty. He said it had been awkward at first, but necessary. Clara listened attentively, without irony or hidden jealousy. She simply said that sometimes, certain ghosts need to be faced so they can finally rest. He smiled. He knew he had made the right choice. And in that moment, with the sunset streaming through the living room window, he felt the cycle had completely closed. Helena, at the end of that day, sat on the small sofa in her new apartment. She took a blank sheet of paper and began writing, not a letter, but a new diary. Not with the goal of reminiscing, but of recording the woman she was becoming. And before sleeping, she looked out the window and thought that maybe, just maybe, some pain comes to remind us that love, true love, requires courage to be lived, and even more courage to be lost with dignity. What remained now was the silence after the storm. And within it, the seed of something new. But there was one final choice to be made. And she would soon learn that not every ending requires a new beginning. Some just need to be accepted. The following month, the community center organized an exhibition of student work from both the writing workshop and the painting classes. The space, previously marked by silences and interrupted stories, was filled with voices, colors, and texts hanging on the walls like fragments of souls slowly stitching themselves together. Helena walked around the room with attentive eyes and a subtle smile. Her hands still bore traces of dried paint, her stained apron seemed an extension of her body, and there was a genuine calm in the way she interacted with the students. She was no longer the woman who always wore heels and spoke sharply. Now she was someone who bore her scars with dignity, without trying to hide them behind expensive clothes or impeccable arguments. She was where she needed to be, even if she didn't yet know what the future held. Across the room, Daniel arrived accompanied by Clara. He remained discreet, preferring to observe the students' texts before greeting the familiar faces. Clara was enchanted by the work, reading each line with the patience of someone who respects stories she hasn't lived, but feels. At one point, they locked eyes with Helena, who merely smiled with a gentle nod, and Clara, with serene kindness, responded in kind. There was no tension, no discomfort, just the recognition of a story that no longer needed explaining. Later, as the hall emptied, Helena approached Clara while Daniel was talking to one of the students who was presenting her favorite poem. The two exchanged glances with the respectful awkwardness of someone who understands exactly what the other represents, without needing to say it. Clara, with a firm, calm voice, broke the silence first, saying she admired her work with the students, that she had seen a rare kind of light in the children's eyes. Helena thanked her sincerely. She tried, every day, to be a better person than she had been. She didn't expect recognition, but hearing it from her was more than she ever imagined she would receive. There was a moment of silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that accommodates feelings that no longer need to compete for space. Clara, before walking away, said she hoped Helena found peace. Helena replied that she was already beginning to feel, for the first time, not the absence of pain, but the presence of something she couldn't yet name, but that felt like forgiveness. Outside, night had already settled in, and the wind carried a slight chill, enough to make bodies huddle slightly inside their coats. Daniel watched the center's facade with his eyes turned upward, as if trying to read something hidden among the stars. Helena approached, slowly, unhurriedly, as if knowing there was no need to rush. The two stood side by side, not looking at each other immediately. She commented on how the students had evolved, how much more they taught her than she could. Daniel smiled and said he knew exactly what she meant, that the teenager's writing had touched him more than he'd expected. Then she asked how he was truly doing. Not as a formality, but as someone who still cared, even knowing the answer might bring a kind of silent pain. Daniel said he was fine. That Clara made him laugh lightly, that she made him feel at peace inside his home. He said he still wrote about old memories, but now with a different perspective, one that came from healing, not from the wound. Helena smiled, a smile that seemed to hurt and heal at the same time. She said she admired that about him, this ability to not harden even after everything. He replied that he'd learned that hardening is a way to prolong pain, not overcome it. She then explained that, in recent days, she had begun responding to old letters he had written to her. Not to give them to him, but to reconnect with herself at that time. She said that rereading his words was like looking into a mirror that showed everything she hadn't known how to appreciate, everything she'd ignored for fear of not being enough. Daniel listened attentively, without judgment. When she finished, she said that perhaps their biggest mistake had been believing that love alone would be enough. And that today she understood that love requires daily choices, a silent commitment to what is built in the details. Helena nodded, her eyes teary but firm. She said that he had undoubtedly been the great love of her life. But that she now knew that love, in itself, is no guarantee of permanence. And that losing it didn't mean it hadn't existed, just that it hadn't survived the absence of care. When they said goodbye, the touch of their hands was light, almost imperceptible, but enough to bring closure to what needed to be. Daniel returned home with Clara, and that night, when they went to bed, she rested her head on his chest and asked if he was okay. He said yes, and this time, there was no hidden noise in that answer. It was true. And in the silence that followed, they both fell asleep with the tranquility of someone who knows they're experiencing a love that doesn't need to be constantly proven. Helena, for her part, spent the night painting. It was as if that final encounter had unlocked something within her. For the first time, he used bright colors, letting the forms flow unchecked. He painted what looked like an open field, with a sky tinged with orange and blue hues, and in the middle of the painting, two paths that separated but carried the same dawn light. When he finished, he sat on the ground and cried. But it wasn't a cry of pain. It was a pure cry, of relief, of acceptance. It was the end of a cycle. The true end. In the following days, she donated most of the clothes and objects that no longer made sense. She rearranged the paintings, reworked her routine, stopped using an alarm clock, and started waking up to the light from the window. She didn't make long-term plans, but she also no longer feared the future. He learned to be with you, and that, after all, was the greatest achievement you could have. He decided to exhibit his paintings at an independent art fair. She didn't expect praise, but wanted to share what had now become a part of her. She received curious visitors, heard sincere comments, sold 2 paintings, and with the money, bought a train ticket to visit a city she'd always dreamed of but never had the time or courage to visit. Daniel continued his writing, publishing a book with chronicles inspired by the workshops, the students, and fragments of what once hurt. The book gained notoriety for its sensitivity and emotional depth. In an interview with a local radio station, he was asked what else he had learned from the experience of teaching young people to write about feelings. He thought for a few seconds and replied that he had learned that pain is not failure. That everyone feels, everyone makes mistakes, but that beauty lies in what we do with what we feel. He said that sometimes, writing is the only place where the past can be reinvented, not to be erased, but to be understood. And that forgiving is not forgetting, but accepting that what doesn't return also teaches. In the audience for the interview recording, among the listeners, Helena sat silently at the back of the studio. It wasn't to see him, but because she loved listening to literature programs. She hadn't expected him to be there, but when she heard his voice, she decided not to leave. She stayed until the end, without identifying herself. She smiled at his words, was moved by others. And when she left the studio, walking through the streets of the city she now recognized with new eyes, she felt that everything was finally exactly where it should be. There were no more loose ends, no unanswered questions. There was only the present. And within it, herself, whole for the first time. On the path of her own choices, Helena followed paths no one could have predicted. And Daniel, alongside Clara, continued to live his truth with ease and respect. Their story, though marked by pain and ruin, became something rare, a memory that no longer hurts. It only teaches. Each day, with each gesture, they both found a new way to live. And amidst it all, a certainty quietly took hold: some losses are not punishment. They are the only way to free ourselves from the illusion that love can survive when left untended. At the turn of another year, time seemed to march on with an inevitable maturity. The pains that once tore at his chest were now nothing more than deep scars, yes, but scars that had stopped bleeding. The city continued with its usual haste, but within those who lived through this story, everything happened at a different pace, slower, more attentive, like someone who had learned that running doesn't always lead to safety. Daniel, now with his second book about to be released, felt like a man who had been whole, shattered, and finally rebuilt with new parts. His writing stopped being about specific memories and began to speak about love as a larger concept, as a pact that demands emotional maturity, renunciation of ego, and honesty that doesn't waver in the face of routine. Clara, increasingly present in his daily life, was like the ground beneath his feet, firm, discreet, and always there. They weren't a couple of grand gestures, but of constant presence. They lived together a morning that was not only his, because Clara, even without having been part of his past, welcomed his pain with the serenity of someone who knows that love does not need to fight for space, it just needs to be true. Their relationship progressed slowly, but with direction. They had been living together for a few months, in a small house surrounded by plants and books. And it was on a random afternoon, over a cup of coffee and spontaneous laughter, that Daniel, with a calm look in his eyes, handed Clara a small box containing a simple, unostentatious, yet meaningful ring. There was no formal proposal, no emotional speeches. Just the direct question: do you want to continue walking with me, every day, one at a time. Clara answered with her eyes, even before her voice. Life, for them, had ceased to be about starting over in a hurry and had become about staying with intention. Meanwhile, Helena, now living in a coastal city where she had moved months earlier, continued her silent process of personal reconstruction. Her art classes continued, this time at an NGO that served vulnerable youth. She didn't talk about the past, didn't share her story, but she was present body and soul in every conversation with her students, in every canvas she began, in every gesture of encouragement she offered. Her art had evolved, it was braver, more emotional, more honest. She exhibited some pieces at local fairs and received invitations to participate in larger exhibitions. Despite this, she refused interviews, refused the spotlight. Not out of fear, but because she understood that some paths must be walked in the silence of humility. One late afternoon, walking barefoot on the sand, she received a call from a former colleague at the agency. She learned that her old boss had been fired for misconduct, that other stories had come to light, other women, other empty promises. Helena listened to it all with a grave silence. She didn't feel vindicated, nor satisfied. The feeling was different, a mixture of relief and sadness, as if part of her finally confirmed that that path had never been real, that she hadn't lost what she thought she was gaining. After hanging up the phone, she sat on the sand and watched the sea, realizing how everything is cyclical, how choices shape entire destinies, and how sometimes the price of not listening to one's conscience is too high. The following month, she received a letter. It had no return address, but the envelope was familiar. Opening it, she found a small, handwritten note in a handwriting she would recognize anywhere. It was from Daniel. He had sent her a copy of his new book, with a simple but meaningful dedication. There is no more pain, only history. And every story, no matter how hard, deserves to be honored for the truth it taught. Thank you. Helena held the book in her hands for long minutes, and for the first time in a long time, she wept with a kind of gratitude she hadn't expected to feel. Not because he had remembered her, but because she knew that, despite everything, they were important to each other. Even though the end was hard. Even though they had lost each other. That night, she walked to the studio she'd set up in the back room of her house and began a new painting. He painted two paths that intersected on the horizon but headed in different directions. He added more light than usual. There were no faces, just the trails and a tree in the center, perhaps a symbol of what had been planted between them and that, despite the distance, had blossomed in another way. Helena didn't yet know what would become of her life in the years to come, but for the first time, she felt truly alive, not just surviving guilt. Months later, Daniel received a letter from a young woman named Anna, one of the students in the writing workshop. In the letter, she said that by participating in those classes, she had decided not to repeat the mistakes of her parents, who had also experienced a history of betrayal. She said that his writing made her understand that love requires emotional maturity, and that not just any passion should be nurtured. Daniel closed the letter with a lump in his throat. He knew that his story had not been in vain and that, in some way, it served as a mirror and a warning. And this is where this story ends. Not with a return, not with a forgiveness that redeems a romance, but with a kind of emotional justice few have the courage to achieve. Helena understood the weight of her decisions and paid for them with time, with absence, and with conscience. But she used this pain to avoid repeating her mistakes. Daniel, on the other hand, didn't allow the betrayal to define him. He knew how to leave with dignity, without revenge, without destruction, and that made him great. And Clara, even though she wasn't the center of the story, showed that it's possible to love someone completely, even if that person came from a broken place. If you've made it this far, please comment on what you thought of this story. Share your opinion, including what part touched you most, what impacted you most. And of course, if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, do so now. Here you'll find intense, real stories that reveal truths many prefer to ignore. This story is a powerful reminder that betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships, it destroys trust, memories, future plans, and self-respect. A single wrong choice can unravel years of emotional development. So think carefully before hurting someone who loves you. Because there won't always be a return. Sometimes forgiveness exists, but love doesn't. And remember, this channel does not condone any kind of cheating. Our stories are fictional, but they carry real-life lessons that touch, alert, and transform. Until the next story.